If I can get everybody's attention, as everybody finishes kind of getting their food and getting seated, we're going to get started because we want to be sure to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion following our presentation, which will start in just a minute. Welcome to all of you. I'm Bill Squadron. I'm president of OurEnergyPolicy.org and the Our Energy Policy Foundation. And a special welcome to everyone here today, and for those of you who have been with us before, I'm sure you noted that we are growing, changing. This is a larger venue, mostly, of course, due to our extremely distinguished guest, Richard Kauffman, but also a reflection of the fact that we as an organization are really taking things to another level, and I'll talk for just a minute about that. But we're finding that the mission of the organization, which is to bring diverse perspectives together online, at live events, in states, everywhere we can develop that kind of dialogue, is really beginning to resonate with many people across the spectrum. We're finding that there's a real interest in having viewpoints that are different politically, viewpoints that take different perspectives from the industry, and it's unusual to bring together people from utilities, corporate finance, law, nonprofit, academia, everybody together who has the same goal, which is to work on sound energy policy for the future of the country. And we're finding even in Washington where it's for the country. And we're finding even in Washington where it's not easy necessarily to bridge divides every day, that message is resonating. And in fact, I put up our website. I don't know how many of you use it regularly. I don't know how many of you exactly. I know a number of you are participants in our discussions online. Many of you exactly. I know a number of you are participants in our discussions online and are registered as expert participants. I would encourage all of you, if you're not, to please visit it and sign up and participate in the discussions. This past week, for example, this one in the upper left on energy security is host Fred Upton, who chairs the Energy Subcommittee in the House. And increasingly we're finding that people on Capitol Hill are using the platform to solicit views from different quarters that they don't typically hear from, and also as a way of reaching out and making their proposals more closely and increasingly with people at the state level. In fact, next week in Detroit at the annual meeting of NASCIO, the National Association of State Energy Officials, we're co-hosting what will be a plenary discussion on electric vehicles. And increasingly we're working with people at the nearing things that are happening here in New York. So I really would urge all of you to do everything you can to be supportive of our efforts to grow. In fact, one of the things we're going to talk to you about in a little while is the fact that as we've grown these institutional sponsors and support, I'd like to thank Con Edison and US Grid for being kind of our initial sponsors. I'm going to turn this over to Jay Warrenklein, the chairman and CEO of US Grid, in just a minute. But I'm talking to a number of you in the room who also have expressed an interest in being supportive of what we're doing. Something that a lot of people realize is we've also created online a resource vehicle, a resource which is a research vehicle. So it's a library of articles, studies, reports, papers, really everything energy related, but it's far better than trying to do research via Google. It's far better than trying to do research via Google because it's very well indexed, tagged, organized in a way that is designed to allow people who are doing work on energy policy issues, whether it's academic work or policy work in the government or advocacy work, to be able to access policy work in the government or advocacy work, to be able to access up-to-date papers and other materials that are being issued on energy subjects. And I'd really encourage all of you to take advantage of this resource. So I'm going to turn this over in just a second to Jay Warrencline. I just want to thank him and U.S. Grid for being supportive. As I said, Con Edison, our other kind of pioneering sponsors here today. And Jay, if you can say a few words, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. So the notion is such an extraordinary boon for us, and to have this platform is a great service. And thank you very much, Bill and Carolyn and team, for all that you've done to make this happen. I would also like to say that this resource is extraordinary, and most of you are probably like me up to this morning, where you haven't really spent a lot of time at the resources and the materials. What I found was, looking at the diversity of issues such as climate change, just on climate change, the white papers and the quality of thinking that's come in the various papers, and the extraordinary pedigree of the authorship of the papers, it gives you in one place a wonderful foundation from which to think about climate change, or electric vehicles, or energy efficiency, or the future of nuclear power, or so many different issues that are thought about in great detail. And I think that I think every one of us will find that it can really help us think more clearly and get some of the ammunition that we want to help form our own views on the subject. So with that in mind, I would just say that thank you very much, Bill, for this. I very much look forward to Richard's comments and remarks, and look forward to helping this organization grow into the kind of potential that it has over the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks. So it's now my privilege to introduce Richard Kauffman. I want to encourage everyone to think about questions and comments, because we'll have plenty of time after his presentation to do what is really the hallmark of our organization, which is to encourage people to express diverse viewpoints, ask questions, engage in a real dialogue, with each other about the issues that Richard's going to talk about. I think probably no one in this room needs me to introduce Richard, because his career has been so extraordinary. I mean, you all know his pedigree in the financial community, which was a leading investor in clean fuels, as an advisor, senior advisor to Energy Secretary Chu, and of course since 2013 in the Cuomo administration as the energy czar for New York State, overseeing the entire energy portfolio in this state, and so forth, and of course as the visionary and architect of the Reforming the Energy Vision initiative, which has served not only as a pioneering force in this space for New York State, but as a model for states all over the country. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Richard Kauffman.
Great, it works. Thanks, Bill, and thank you, Jay. Thank you all. I have to say, thank you, Jay. Thank you all. I have to say I'm a little embarrassed to be standing up here in front of all of you, because for a couple of reasons. One, there are a lot of energy experts in the room, and second of all, there are many people in the room that have really been a key part of REV, and so again, welcome. I do have a presentation, and so maybe it would be useful for me to run through the presentation, because I think we're not bad at policy, but we're not so good at explaining policy. It's not a core competence, isn't always very sexy. So we would always very much welcome the input of people that could help us figure out how we can communicate what we're doing in a way that is understandable. My wife tells me, what's the one floor elevator pitch? And I'm not, also want to thank this group for all the work you do. And in particular, I'm grateful for the interest in state work, because so much of energy discussion often takes place about what are the feds going to do. And actually, for a long time, perhaps people didn't realize, and actually, for a long time, perhaps people didn't realize it, states have a really important role in energy policy. It's actually shared with the federal government. And the other thing is obviously the energy transition is occurring. It's not something that is going to occur. It is already underway. And so something that is going to occur, it is already underway. And so what we see is, as Justice Brandeis said, states are laboratories of democracy. And across many states, not just New York, and not just blue states, but also red states are trying to figure out what this energy transition means at the state level. And so, as in other areas, we might expect in the past, in other policy areas, in the telecom area is a good example, it may be that a lot of policy is going to get worked out at the state level and eventually will get rolled up at the federal level when there's more consensus. They said, and as Bill said, these energy issues in the past have not been partisan issues. They've often been geographical issues, not political partisanship. And so I think that we have a lot to learn from each other, from different states. Okay, failed the first test. Okay, so the first thing is it's interesting for those that are not familiar with states. So in about half the states in white, these are talking about utilities. They own generation, transmission, and distribution. And the states in blue, and New York is one of them, when we talk about utilities, they're just wires companies. So Con Ed and National Grid are here. They don't own generation in New York State. They are just wires companies. And so it means that prices in wholesale markets and the utilities, the distribution utilities, get their returns from a regulated rate of return in the past. All right, so we have a clean energy standard. 50% of our power is going to come from renewable sources by 2030. And this is not a by 2030. And this is not a goal, this is a mandate. But we're not going to achieve this 50% renewable mandate by doing what we've been doing, which has been to bolt on distributed energy resources and renewable energy onto a grid architecture that wasn't designed for this purpose. So we have a grid architecture, it's hard to see, but this is the sort of basic grid architecture of George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla. And this architecture has electrons flowing in one direction over sometimes hundreds of miles from large power plants to consumers. And supply is determined on a given day by a fixed estimate of demand. What we've been doing is we have been bolting onto this grid all kinds of resources for which it was never intended for. So we bolted solar onto the grid. And so what's happened is it's been, and other things, it's been good. You have combined heat and power, maybe have more reliability. You have a fuel cell, maybe have better power quality. There are lots of reasons. Good for those customers. But the question has been good for all customers? And this has, of course, been at the root of the debate in other states about net metering. So the question is, we need to have a different grid, a fundamentally different grid architecture. And this one you can see is more complicated. And you've seen this picture one way or another in the past. But this is a grid that's a mix of large power plants and distributed energy resources, that electrons flow in more than one direction, where supply and demand are dynamic, and the intermittency of renewable resources are paired with storage and adjustable load. And arguably, we're never going to be able to decarbonize our whole economy unless we build this kind of grid. Because when we think about electrification of transportation or electrification of heat, we need to have this kind of grid. So the question is, why aren't we? It's because we have policies and regulations that in the past have just been keeping us, or that have been, we've just been rebuilding the old grid over and over again. And so actually what we've been trying to do in a kind of analogous way, in the same way that we've been bolting on physical resources onto a grid, policies onto a policy regime that was also intended to do something entirely different. You want solar? Great, let's bolt on a solar policy. Want energy efficiency policy? Let's bolt on an energy efficiency policy. So the good news in all this, thinking about this new grid that we need to build, is that the current grid is energy inefficient, and we know that. That's not really news to anybody here, I think, because it was never designed to be energy efficient. But the other part is that the current grid is financially inefficient. And so one measure of the financial inefficiency of the grid is to look at it in terms of its average capacity utilization, which in New York and in most places is a little bit more than 50%. Now, if you look at other capital-intensive industries in the last 35 or 40 years, in order to respond to global competition, they've had to significantly improve their average capacity utilization to incentives and changes in business model. We may not like the airlines, but the airlines used to have 50% average capacity utilization. Now they're at 90% average capacity utilization. And that has resulted, because of what customers have wanted, significantly lower costs. In other industries too. So the grid is built for the hottest hours of the days or the year, but customers pay all year long. And we can have a debate with the utility industry about how much excess capacity we need, but arguably we can do a lot better. And I want to tell you that if we could move the average capacity utilization over time to something that looks closer to other industries, we're talking about billions of dollars a year in New York State. And those billions of dollars could be used to provide eventual customer saving to help build this 21st century grid. And as I say here, because the current grid is so financially inefficient, we can largely build a new grid within the cost envelope of the existing bill. And this is really where, when we talk about partisan issues, this is where find common ground. So when you boil REV down, reforming the energy vision, it kind of boils. There are lots of policies, lots of initiatives, but when you really boil it down, it comes down to three buckets. The first is locational value for distributed energy resources. Because if we think about this grid that's supposed to be a mix of large power plants and distributed resources, where are the distributed resources supposed to be? Well, they should be on places on the grid where they're going to be good for not just those customers, but where distributed resources can benefit all customers. And so let's talk about that. So it's often in the case where there's a grid constraint. In a grid constraint, if you think about electrons flowing like water, there are constraints in the grid. Every utility has constraints in the grid. We're blessed in these purple areas to have a number of grid constraints, although we don't call them grid constraints, we call them opportunity zones. Distributed resources in these areas of grid constraint is where they're going to have the most value. And so providing a price signal to developers to go in these locations is going to mean not only lower costs because you have resources dedicated to developing those projects in those locations, but it's going to mean that the resources for those customers, but also provide economic value to the grid as a whole. And so this has been the successor to net metering in New York State. We haven't done it perfectly, but we have now established a value for distributed energy resources as a price signal, for the market. And that is now being replicated slowly, I think is going to be replicated in other places around the country. So the second thing is to change regulated utility financial incentives and business practices. Because in New York State, when we talk about the price signals associated with the value of distributed energy resources, you know, that's great for the market, has nothing to do with utility financial incentives. The way things work in New York State, again, the utilities are wires companies. We have what's called decoupling, which means the utilities have no financial compensation based upon use more electricity. They don't get paid any more money. They get rates which compensate the utility for the cost of service. So really, when you talk about changing tariffs, you're just providing price signals. You're rearranging the pot of revenues. You're not changing the total revenues for the utility. So if we're going to change, in our view, if we're going to build this grid of the future, it is absolutely regulated utilities, financial incentives, and business practices. So, and this is where I know some of my utility colleagues are going to object, but this is the traditional utility business model, for dummies maybe. It's, you know, through rates, utilities recover the cost of providing the service plus a regulated return. The greater the profit, the more capital deployed, higher rates unless there are more customers to share the costs. So what's wrong with this model? This is where we're going to may have some more debate. We think it's expensive. We can be hardly surprised that we have upon how much capital that's deployed. So we have capital that's built for the hottest couple of days of the year, but we pay for it all year long. I mean, we would argue that it's a deterrent to the adoption of new technology. If you think about IT and how IT has revolutionized other industries, how does a regulate IT investments? Are those investments actually investments, capital investments on which a utility can earn a rate of return? Or are they actually reducing traditional capital, and so therefore there's less opportunity to earn a profit? And so therefore there's less opportunity to earn a profit because there's less traditional capital deployed. And in fact, we think that also it discourages the use of distributed energy resources because, in fact, it's in these areas of grid constraint that there's the potential to actually keep building capital as opposed to encouraging distributed energy resources from being deployed. Because the thing about New York is the utilities have not permitted utilities, just like the utilities don't own distributed energy resources. So if we want to have the distributed energy resources located in areas that make sense, it requires a change in how utilities approach their business model. So this is a customer bill, typical customer bill, and get this red line. The utility profit is 6 to 7% of the average customer bill. So 93 to 94% of the bill is a pass-through cost from the utility on which the utility earns nothing, just gets cost recovery. And so when we talk about sort of financial inefficiency or challenges to innovation, we need to look at the bill. Because in every other business that you know of, that 93 to 94% would be thought of as that 93 to 94% would be thought of as a wallet share, as the opportunity to bring in innovation, to reduce costs, improve value to customers, and for the business to earn something for itself. And up to now, that has not been an opportunity for utilities. That has not been an opportunity for utilities. The only opportunity the utility has had for the profit has been based upon deployment of capital. Now, this is where there's the shout out to Con Ed, because this is really a critical change not far from here. So in Brooklyn and Queens, there was an area of load growth. And so the traditional solution would have been $1.2 billion in new substations that we might guess 4% like the rest of the system. And instead of a request for proposal that we're going to build 1.2 billion of substations, what Con Ed did was something different. It was more along the lines of a request for solution. And instead of $1.2 billion, included solar, storage, efficiency, CHP, and demand response, that cost $200 million. So we're talking about $1 billion of savings in capital, and that doesn't include the savings to customers that come from a reduction in delivering peak power costs to New York City in the middle of summer. And it deploys innovative technology. And what's happened now, and this is really a credit to all the utilities in the state, they have now adopted capital planning, what's called non-wires alternatives in the state. So National Grid is, I think you've got, more than 24 of these kind of projects under consideration. So this utility procurement, we'll call it utility procurement 2.0, you don't need high tech to get going. So this is another call out to, bipartisanship. You don't need high tech for this. You don't need to figure out what the utility of the future is. Every utility knows when utility of the future is. Every utility knows when it's going to commit capital. That's not, that's not high tech. Every utility knows kind of where there's an area of grid constraint. So the utility can go to the market and say, this is what we were going to do, and this is what it was going to cost, and the market can come back and see if there's something that's better and cheaper under non-wires alternatives. And then the utility and the regulator can evaluate the alternative, and if alternatives are cheaper, the utility can earn a share of savings, and that is how this model has developed in New York State, so that the utilities can earn a share of savings. So it is a different financial model than committing capital. A share of savings. So it is a different financial model than committing capital. It is a financial model which is about a share of savings. Now, just to give you an idea, this is a big idea, because if every utility in the country followed this approach of non-wires solutions, the carbon benefit could reach 3.5 billion metric tons between now and 2030, which is the equivalent of the entire U.S. wind fleet today. This is one idea. Now, I showed you this chart before. Remember, I want you to look now at the light blue, which is about half the cost of the customer bill, which is the fuel costs. Again, that's a pass-through cost on which the regulated utilities earn nothing until today, because now the utilities have an opportunity to earn a share of saving from fuel costs, from wholesale power costs. So we can go beyond this non-wires alternatives, beyond this deferred capital, which is another way of saying this thing, same thing. So utilities now have an incentive to reduce power supply costs, and we're now going to see whether, the famous negawatts. When you ride the subway and you see those signs that say, turn in your refrigerator, get $50 from Con Ed, or, whatever it is, those $50 isn't coming from Con Ed. It's coming from other customers. This would be a business for Con Ed and for the other utilities. And we got to see if we're going to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of our emissions reductions. In our view, we must turn energy efficiency into a business as opposed to a matter of regulatory compliance. Grid edge activity with government resources. And what do we mean by that? Well, we have collected from customers more than $1 billion a year in the past to support clean energy programs, 85% of which are in the form of one-time grants. And so it's great. You build some projects. No. And so the question is, what else can we do? Because New York State, even as big a state as New York, we're never going to influence the cost of wind turbines. We're never going to influence the cost of solar panels. These hard costs, we're not a big enough market. But we can have a meaningful influence. We're not a big enough market. But we can have a meaningful influence on the soft costs. So our $5.2 billion clean energy fund, the emphasis is on reducing soft costs like financing or the cost of customer acquisition. And so I think people are familiar or the cost of customer acquisition. And so I think people are familiar with the solarized programs. We didn't invent the solarized programs. That's where a community gets together and decide, and they want to deploy solar. This is an incredible bang for the buck for deploying residential solar, because the government is spending a relatively little amount of money, now done that across a variety of sectors. This is a way in which we can lower soft costs by aggregating demand, by standardizing processes, by trying to figure out what data we can provide. And I can answer more if you have more questions on that. Lowering financing costs is the New York Green subsidized credit. But there are sectors in the private sector financing markets where capital is not available. The problem is availability of credit, not the cost of credit. Because of bank capital rules, it's really expensive for a bank to lend generally, not just in the clean energy area. Long maturity, things that are just a little bit below investment grade. These are really expensive for banks to lend to these kinds of things. And it's very expensive for a bank to give an unfunded line of credit. This is where the Green Bank has played a meaningful role. It's lent $600 million 3 times to projects that would not have otherwise been built in New York State. And the money that came to fund the Green Bank came from what would have otherwise been one-time programs. So now, instead of it just being a grant that would have been given out to build a project and that would have been the end of it, get paid back, can lend the money again and create much more scale than past programs. All right, I'm coming to the end. The other reason why we're very focused on this stimulating grid edge activity is we need to build an IT system on top of the physical system. Right? That grid that I described, that 21st century grid, is a smart grid. It requires a lot of IT. And we think that it's essential to have competitive market actors be in an interface with the distribution utilities to help build this IT system. So if you think about your phone, or you have an Apple phone or whatever, Apple does not develop the apps. Apple has a platform. There's a feedback loop that Apple gets from knows how to invest more in its platform to make that platform more valuable to the app providers. It's this market test. That's one of the things that's critical in what we do to stimulate competitive markets to help build this great IT system, which doesn't yet exist. And we do not believe, and this is maybe a debate for another time, we're skeptical that any state that has a fully integrated, robust competitive markets around customers is going to be very good at building this kind of IT infrastructure. It would be like Apple trying to come up with every app on its own. So I talked about Edison before. This is the end here, you know. And the thing about, of course, Edison was about lighting. And this is the end here, you know. And the thing about, of course, Edison was about lighting and his ideas about lighting. But of course, you know, electricity is a lot more about lighting today. And so I just leave you with this thought that we may be again at a time where because of the effect of technology and distributed technology, which is around us, that there's going to be opportunities for a whole new set of ways in which we can get value from electrons. And so obviously people talk about transportation example, but it can be more than that. You know, and it's also about government policy because, you know, we think about, you know, light bulbs. You should change your light bulbs because to save money. Well, you know, there are people that care about that, but these light bulbs actually want. But can you imagine there are people that have developed lighting that help your kids sleep at night? Not your teenagers. They don't need that. That's a joke. But the point is that this is a value-added service, a change in the value of the electron. You could imagine an appliance leasing business, similar to the solar leasing business, where the offer to customers is not about saving the planet, but new appliances. But the thing about these appliances in the new grid is they're going to have devices in them to permit those devices to be aggregated and participate in the demand response market. They're going to be more energy efficient. And so there's a business model maybe for somebody in there that can participate in the policies that we have in place. Or it's home health care, because home health care, and we have had some companies talk to us about home health care. Home health care will be cheaper, better quality care. It's going to require a home automation system. That home automation system can be monetized to provide energy benefits. You're not going to shut, can be used to help shape the load. The point is, we don't know what kind of opportunities can come. We're trying to establish a basic policy platform. So it's not just about saving the planet or saving the money. It's about providing an opportunity for whoever can participate in competitive markets, that it's got an idea that can. And so I just leave this last thing, which is, you know, Nest has got 1 million apps that are developed, one of which controls the temperature in people's beds. So it may be that the path to solution to climate change goes through somebody's bed. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. You had this message in, Marjorie. Marjorie Hart.
I thought you were my conscience there.
No. You've had this message in place for, I think, more than a few months now. And I'm wondering what trajectory you see for success in achieving some, recognizing we have a mandate to get to recognizing we have a mandate to get to 50 by 30, but in terms of the creating the financial incentives to incent this and make it move along. Then could I also tack onto that one question about the relationship between the state and FERC. I heard yesterday of a Hudson Valley zone which is presumably to enable peaking power by creative federal incentives to bring in gas-fired facilities into that zone, which is, we looked at this and feel it's going to encourage quite a bit of gas use in that area. We wonder how this goes against some of the things you're trying to do, and is there any resolution to that kind of problem if I'm right?
Okay, so I'll take the second part, and then I'm going to call out to our utility colleagues in the room that can talk about the first part. What we've done in government is we've laid out. If you think about, just back up for 1 second. If you think about the point about the rebuilding of the IT system that we did, or the telephony system in the country. Government didn't do that, a whole series of mandates. We didn't say we're going to do a certain number of switches or a certain number of modems, right? There were some broad policy frameworks were set up, and then the private sector figured it out. And that's what we're trying to do here in the power sector. And so we've tried to create a policy framework. The utilities can work with the solar companies and other innovative energy companies. And so we've created these different kinds of financial incentives, so I'm going to have the utilities respond to see what they think, all right? On the FERC thing, this is an example where, we haven't meant for anything that we're doing. We didn't rely upon the federal government. It wasn't the Obama Clean Power Plan that initiated our policies. We're doing the things in New York because we think it's the right thing to do from an economic standpoint. There are 1 million people in New York that are having difficulty paying their power bills. From a resiliency standpoint, from an economic development standpoint, and we've been using state authorities to do things. Having said that, FERC controls the wholesale markets, as I said, because in New York State, utilities don't own generation. As I said, because in New York State, utilities don't own generation. The compensation for generators comes from wholesale markets, and that's FERC's jurisdiction. So if you think about that chart and the grid of, yesterday, it really made sense to think of a line of demarcation between wholesale markets at the federal level and retail markets being governed by the state. Well, when electrons start flowing in one direction, more than one direction, and you have, the possibility of my trading power with you, that begins to need to have a new partnership between FERC and the states. That has not happened yet. And the point about the zones, this is in terms of the I guess, like psychotherapy, what really works. The argument in favor of where utilities own generation is about cost, because utilities have lower cost of capital, and so that's the argument why about half the states the utilities own generation. The argument about competitive markets is exactly the same argument. That competition in generation is going to result in lower costs, even if the cost of capital of competitive market actors that build generation is higher than the utility. So if we believe in competitive markets, in wholesale markets, generally, however, it's up to the ISO and FERC to be sure that there are adequate resources and that the market works properly. And so they felt that they needed to set up a new zone. We didn't agree with the zone. We didn't agree on the timing of the new zone, but ultimately that was their decision. And in terms of what resources come into the market, this is we have our policies, but ultimately market participants risk. Who wants to take?
All right. So John Bruckner, National Grid, and I too want to thank you, Richard, for the presentation. It was it's always insightful when we hear from you, so I appreciate it. And I will start as far as the success. I think the question was, what is Richard? So I can't answer for Richard, but I'll answer for National Grid. And I think there's a couple of things that have proven out. So first and foremost, I think we'll be successful. There's no question about it. I think we will be successful. I don't know that I would put a time frame on it. Richard says 50% by 2030. We'll get there. I don't know exactly when we'll. Richard talked about the dynamic of the policy and what's keeping if you will, the paradigm the way it is, which is, look, invest more, you earn more of a return on that investment as a utility. But things are changing, right? So through policy, we are now incented, and we have earning adjustment mechanisms that go beyond. We do know that there is a place for investment. And it's not just for a load or additional load or capacity to meet peak demand in the summer. There's reliability investment that needs to be made as well. So I think we do have to bucketize certain investments. So when we look at reliability investments, I think we may have to put them in a different bucket than investments for adding for peak demand and so forth. But those earning adjustment mechanisms is new. It's new for us as well, and it's significant. I won't go to the dollars that it provides this opportunity for, but I will tell you one thing utilities don't like to do is leave opportunity on the table. So we're not yet taking the advantage of what staff has provided for us in rates as far as an opportunity to earn the maximum return on those investments. But be sure we will. We will, because it's the right thing to do, not only for our customers, not only for us as employees, but also for our shareholders as well, which we need to be attuned to. I also will share that there is more, and I commend Con Ed as well for their solutions. I think they're terrific, but it also creates momentum in our industry as a whole. And when we look next door to our neighbor and we see what they're doing, it incites us to do the same thing. And we're doing things in New York with non-wire solutions, prove the technology, because I think in many cases demo projects will work. That's why we put them on the table, but we need to prove that we can scale them. And then with our colleagues in New England, we too have solutions where we've thwarted additional capital where, if you take the island in Nantucket, we were looking at a $100 million investment to bring in another cable through a battery storage solution, which will provide that same capacity, but we don't need that in excess of 100. So those solutions are there. I think what we need to do is continue to multiply those opportunities. They are there, but again, balancing reliability and investment for unutilized capital, if you will, I think we have to be a little more careful about.
Stuart Nachmias for Con Edison. Just appreciate the opportunity to be here, and agree also with many things John said. I just wanted to maybe bring a little reality to the question, and one of the examples in the Brooklyn Queens demand management program is a place called Marcus Garvey, a low-income housing complex that really took advantage of the program, and they participated. There's solar on the rooftops. They have a battery that's able to provide resiliency, but also peak reduction for us. And there's also a fuel cell there as part of the solution, which is great, using National Grid gas to fuel it. But what makes it work is not only the innovation, that have been very active and working with customers, which is great, the new technologies that have been developed, and the incentives I think Richard talks about in terms of reducing the cost to customers. But there's one other piece of it, and maybe just to bring up, the $200 million that was allocated for the program instead of the $1.2 billion, half a dozen other locations, smaller scale, throughout our service territory. But we also recover those $200 million as a regulatory asset over about a 10-year period. And that really is a benefit to customers, because we don't want to recover all the money in 1 year. Customers change, first of all, over time to recover from the customers we have. We also want to recover it over the time period that there'll be a benefit that we anticipate from those investments and those assets that are put in place with the third parties. So that is a piece of the puzzle that really is beneficial to utilities because it gives more certainty the stream, both for customers and bill impacts, as well as for utilities and financing that over that period of time. So I just wanted to add that to the equation. And I think as a package, it really works, and we're working, I think, very well with many third parties in many different areas, not only on these programs.
I'm Michael Lubell, professor of physics at CCNY. I've been involved in energy policy for a long time. Question for you is that how would you compare what is going on in New York State with California, which of course has been a leader in this area as well, in particular the demand side management? What are the lessons California, if you could?
No, thank you very much. So So, of course, we have to acknowledge the leadership of California. They have been at this for years, have deployed lots of renewable energy. I guess we have the benefit of being, I don't want to say a fast follower, but a follower. The challenge that California has had, when you know about the duck curve, is that they have tried to make progress, and you could say Germany is the same kind of example, without thinking about it on a system-wide basis. So it's really been in terms of different technologies from a series of mandates. And so when we started here in New York, it's kind of what I said a little bit ago, that we said, look, you're not going to build the 21st century grid based upon a series of government, and that's not the way we rebuilt complex systems, and the power sector is a very complex sector. So, how do we know that, the answer is storage? Maybe the answer is transmission. Maybe the answer is, a piece of software. How can we know? So I think we've learned that actually there's real value in establishing mandates because it provides a size of a prize to developers and to the private sector. And so we have mandates. However, we'd like to feel that result of our policy as opposed to driving the policy. So we've come out with numbers after we think we would get there based upon all the other stuff we talked about. So we have now a storage target and an energy efficiency target, but they're not based upon how much money we would spend in order to fulfill that objective, which is the traditional way that the mandates have been established. Now, California, I think, so that's what we've learned from California, the value of mandates to establish markets. I think what California has learned from us is establish markets. I think what California has learned from us is that actually needing to look at things on a systemic basis and come up with approaches that are going to allow market participants to figure things out better, to build this system of the future. So to figure things out better, to build this system of the future. The very first thing I talked about, which was the value distributed energy resources, where are they supposed to be? California has a proceeding now that's going to move them in that direction away from net metering. And so I was with the California commissioners last week and staff, and we have a bunch of areas in which we are collaborating. They're quite interested in a number of things that we're doing.
Thank you, Richard, for your visionary leadership. Could you talk about the role of energy storage in the grid of the future?
Well, so plays a role, a huge role in dealing with intermittency and dealing with peak. Lots of opportunities for storage. So this is a couple things to talk about here, if it's okay. I mean, the first thing related to the first question was the challenge we had with some of the storage people in the storage business. And they came to us and they said, why can't you be like California and have procurements for storage? And you can already know me well enough to know what my answer was, which is, well, how do we know storage is the right answer? And we already have a system which is financially inefficient. And of course, the way that these mandates are funded is through charging customers more money. So why would we do it that way? We should try to figure out what's in the customer bill already. And so that wasn't necessarily a great first conversation, but what it did lead to was the storage companies coming back and engaging with us and engaging with the utilities and engaging with the sort of the value distributed energy resources thing. This has a whole series of things in the values to make up the components. And so the storage industry now is trying to figure out how it can make things work in New York, given our policy. But it's an interesting challenge. It's an interesting challenge because the way that the project from a stream of a series of different revenue streams, some that come from the wholesale market and some that come from, as it were, retail stuff. So if you defer capital through a storage project, that money is coming from what's controlled through the state market that's controlled by the feds. But the point is it's several different kind of revenue streams, and those revenue streams are challenging for traditional project finance. And in addition, they have some of the revenue streams are short-term, like capacity. It's difficult to attract debt for a long-dated infrastructure project if you have short-term revenues. So the challenge is how you get this to work with different revenue streams, and ultimately the need to have some party that's going to enter into a long-term contract. So in order to get the financing to support the project. And I know there are people that are in this room working on this exact question. And so, you know, we're getting there. We will get there on storage, but it really is the there. We will get there on storage, but it really is the belly of the beast of how you make these policies work. When you go from a mandate to something that involves looking at the cost envelope of the bill and stitching together the different revenue streams and what's the role of the utility, since the utility can't own the asset value, and so the question is, can we get the utilities to enter into contracts for which they're going to get economic value that come from either deferred capital or from a reduction in capacity payments or other things, and earn a share of savings, and that contract can be used to help finance the project. So it really is how REV can work as we, you know, go beyond the non-wires alternatives to some other, you know, deployment of storage and scale. Jay, do you have thoughts on this?
Thank you. Theme that I think is pervasive through the issues you've discussed and all the actions that under your leadership have been taken is really the issue of carbon reduction. And the fact is, if I were to characterize your role and the state's role and what it has done, I think, brilliantly and effectively, it is really to get us on a path towards very substantially reducing carbon emissions in New York State and having New York State be a pioneer for carbon reduction. God knows we need that desperately. So my own thinking about this is the storage roadmap, for example, that has been issued under NYSERDA and the Department of Public Services leadership. The fact that you have the 50 by 30 mandate on renewables, and action after action that you've described. I think you've been too modest to really say this, but I just want to say that for me, the real primary message of everything that we're discussing about New York State's policies and the extraordinary work that Con Edison, National Grid, and others are doing is really the idea that we will, in fact, set the pace for how a state can reduce carbon dramatically. So that, for example, we're in a position through battery storage, and we're in discussions with utilities and others on this. We're in a position to put massive amounts of battery storage at some of the large, at our plant, Ravenswood, which I'm chairman of, 1,500 megawatts that we're proposing to put in by 2025. And so many other players are in a position to do their share of what's needed to be done. What I see happening, and you haven't talked about this, but I'm curious about how you think about it, is if we think about transportation, the massive portion of New York's carbon that's going to come from in my mind, we're now seeing costs coming down at such a rapid pace, and the ability to think about creative charging solutions, that to me, the issues of, number one, transportation migration and the policies that New York State, I think, will inevitably put in to encourage that or to mandate that in the future, where people will know that that's happening and can adapt to it and make plans in advance so that you're not hurting people and there's no social justice issue about that. Or the building transformations, what the Public Service Commission, Department of Public Service are now doing with respect to how do we reduce carbon emissions from buildings, and the massive things that are now being done in buildings, and the massive things that are now being discussed. I think that we're on a trajectory that really is what you have said is we are objective oriented. You're not going to specify to a player how to achieve the objective, but the state's going to mandate certain objectives, and we will have an end result mandated. To me, the most important part of that and the most heartening part of that is really that all of these things that we have talked about really result in a massive amount of carbon reduction, which will enable other states looking at this to say, the states have taken the leadership, states and city governments are taking the leadership, and we will in fact reduce our carbon dramatically, far more than people anticipate. And that's just really the only supplement I wanted to add to what you said.
All right. Well, thank you, Jay. So we have a lot more to do from a carbon standpoint, as you point out, because the electricity sector is, a minority of the emissions. So autos are a substantial portion, and the building stock. So we have a lot more to do. We started with the power sector. We started with the power sector because we, as I said before, we're not going to be able to really, I think, take advantage of the storage potential in the batteries, but we also don't want people to charge all at the same time. If we can't build batteries, but we also don't want people to charge all at the same time. If we can't build an underlying smart grid, it's going to be very difficult to deploy large-scale electric transportation. Same thing with we need to get customers off of fuel oil, and same thing with we need to get customers off of fuel oil, and we can't, because we still use a lot of fuel oil, so we have to electrify heating, and so again, that also involves the ability to optimize that resource. The second thing that I want to say really is your point about states, and what I said at the beginning of the energy transition has already happened, or is happening. The cost of distributed solutions are going down. The cost of renewables continue to go down. Customer preferences are changing at the individual, community, and corporate level. More control over their energy, for resilience, or more renewables. The cost of the traditional way we've had benefits of reduction of generation costs from shale gas, but costs of distribution continue to go up. You're not getting a lot of digital in the way that we productivity benefits from digital stuff when you're digging up streets and stuff like that. So it means that load growth around the country is for utilities is flat, or in some cases declining. So you have a distributed solution, or doing that, leaving the cost of the system spread over fewer customers. These are issues which are facing utilities in virtually every state. And so, when you think about shale gas, you're not going to put a coal power plant next to your factory, natural gas next to your factory, or next to your, a set of new homes. So there are meaningful stresses on the system. And so the only question is sort of how long this transition is going to take, which is obviously critical in considering climate change. How much wasted, stranded assets we're going to have. What's going to cost us all to do this? So that's why we're trying to. We saw these long-term trends. That's why we try to get ahead of them. Whether we're going to be right or not, I don't know. That's why we try to get ahead of them. Whether we're going to be right or not, I don't know. One of the approaches we're taking is a market-based approach fundamentally, because we think if we can figure this out, we'll be able to get the economic development benefits that can come from it. We also think, by the way, that when we talk about value-added services, we don't know what value-added services are going to take place. But states are in competition for talent and young people. Are you going to? There's some theory, I guess. Are you really going to want to work at a state which doesn't have I'm not talking about a green power sector necessarily, so we don't know. It's very possible that those states that kind of just don't want to change, whether they're eventually going to lose a war for talent. So it is a very dynamic time, and that's why this whole state innovation question is really something that I'm very grateful that people are interested in.
Future plan. A couple of questions about solar. First off, are there any companies making solar panels in New York State where we could actually benefit not only from the panels but the economic activity? And secondly, I was pleased to hear you talk about mandates. Is there any consideration of putting a mandatory requirement that for all new housing construction, solar be on the roof?
Okay, so quickly, yes, there is a manufacturer of solar. Actually, Tesla manufactures solar roof tiles in Buffalo. So that's one. There are other manufacturers that we've been the tariffs. It's also because manufacturers like to be often close to where markets are. So New York State is now the third largest solar market in the country, which is really a surprise. When we've been procuring for large-scale renewables now, as part of the 50% mandate, utility-scale solar renewables now, as part of the 50% mandate, utility-scale solar is now finally competitive in New York State. Who would have thought? We're not Arizona in terms of the amount of sun resources, but it's a measure of how costs have declined, and also if you establish a market, establish a market size, you attract industry participants. So the issue of building codes and these kind of mandates, this is a real challenge in the state because building codes are generally very local requirements. We have a very strong tradition of home rule, and one of the challenges that has happened in the past when there have been state construction essentially become unfunded mandates for inspectors. In other words, so we impose certain requirements, and then you go around most of New York State is pretty rural. You go around and you find that the inspectors just don't have the capacity to do this kind of stuff. So in general, we've been, and New York State does not want to be in the business of, I think, generally mandating New York City building codes. I mean, that's something New York City has been doing. So in general, I think there's always a political cost to imposing these kind of mandates. There's always a political cost to imposing these kind of mandates. And that's why the emphasis where we can has been more on markets rather than things that are, kind of hard mandates. As I said before, generally what we do with our mandates in storage, energy efficiency, and so forth is as a result of the things that we're doing as opposed to something that we think is going to ultimately cause a lot of pain.
Hi, Richard. Rob Watson, Chief Sustainability Officer with EcoHub. I appreciate you leading the way in the transition from energy commodities to energy services. This is a conversation that's been going on for a long time, and thank you for actually doing something about it. And I think the IT overlay is really important for moving from a central grid to one of essentially a network of microgrids, which I think is where we'll see the 21st century as a quote-unquote renewable energy source. Are you going to distinguish between organics and gas coming from anaerobic digestion, pyrolysis of rubbers, and other sorts of things? Is there a definition of waste as renewable or non-renewable, and where do those lines get drawn?
Well, what I would say about this is that, and Andy, you're here. You can help out on some of this stuff. One of the challenges that we have with with our progress on our policy generally, we've been doing it all administratively as opposed to going to the legislature, and we've been able to make as much progress as we've been able to do because we've been able to get stakeholders to generally be supportive of what we've been doing. So there's a lot of winners because we don't produce oil and gas in the state, for example. So generally speaking, a lot of winners. It becomes much more challenging in areas where to get stuff, and that's why, having been in the private sector, I'm really surprised how quickly things can move when you can get stakeholders to go along. I'm really surprised how quickly things can move when you can get stakeholders to go along. Okay, so now we talk about the waste energy challenge. The waste energy challenge is that there are certain members of the environmental community that, for example, think if we develop waste or support waste energy projects, it's going to reduce recycling. And so they think the recycling ought to be the first and most important policy that takes place. So we have had a lot of difficulty with a number of the projects because it's because of legitimate policy disagreement. And so I'm going to kick it over to Andy to.
What's really important with what Richard is doing is sort of moving the state and the whole system toward this platform on which they all have to find a way to make their case and be and find acceptance by the consumers and in politics. But we need that platform to be there so that new ideas and new sources of energy can come and plug in and compete and be part of the mix, and plug in and compete and be part of the mix. So I think that's a really essential part of what you're doing. And I'm glad also that you mentioned the electrification challenge coming for buildings and for vehicles. I'm just curious for buildings and for vehicles. I'm just curious. We see across the country that as cities and states look to try to meet their obligations or their targets on the climate side, long term it's just very hard to get there without a significant shift away from fossil fuel use in transportation and in buildings, and that seems to mean electrification. How does that electrification challenge affect what you're doing? Is your platform going to be enough to handle that, or are there other to sort of enable that transition?
Well, on electrification and heating, I think that's something that we can get our arms around. On the transportation side, we are working with other states, as you know. We have operation through REGI. And so we're working with the other REGI states to see if it makes sense to have a cost of carbon for the transportation sector, because that obviously will help a lot. And so where when you say what else kind of do we need, it would be to have a kind of a regional approach in transportation.
My name is Herschel Spector. Thank you for a very exciting presentation. I want to follow through on some forth. In New York, 82% of the greenhouse gases that are emitted come from the end-use sectors, transportation, heating in homes, commercial, et cetera, and so forth. And the REV program, which I greatly adore, is half of that 18%, but it's actually not fully half because about a third of that is from hydro. So right now, this REV program which is starting us on our way, is worth about roughly 6% of the greenhouse gas, roughly 6% of the greenhouse gases that are emitted. But going back to what Jay was saying, if you really want to deal with the other 82%, electrify them, you're going to have to need a lot more sources of many types for electricity. Now, recently, the National Renewable Energy Lab sort of looked into this just in terms of transportation, and they haven't read the report yet, but the title was, you had to increase the electricity production by 38% just for the transportation.
Mm-hmm.
My own calculations, which were with the NU sectors,
Mm-hmm.
which brings me now to my primary question, something I personally am rather alarmed with, and perhaps you are too. This is my question to you: is, are you alarmed that this REV program may be completely wiped out by now the present plan for NISO? And in fact, that is counter to the commitment that the governor made when he signed the agreement to shut down Indian Point. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. A couple of things in reply. I mean, the first again is you have to think about, REV as an underlying, building an underlying utility platform or underlying electricity platform that's going to efficiently enable more renewables, more electrification of transport, and more electrification of transport and electrification of heating. So, we know we need to have we already have an 80% target of emissions reductions by 2050, 40% by 2030. We're over 1990 levels. We're very focused on that, and so we're not going to be able to do it just by focusing just on the electricity sector. So I want you to think about that in context. The second point I'd make is with respect to resources, there are actually a lot of resources that are available. We are going to be doing the first procurements of offshore wind. The Canadians are over us all the time in terms of the ability to deliver lots of hydro wind from Canada. So, again, the question is, if we're getting there, isn't just bolting on all these renewables with all this fossil fuel backup. It's going to be prohibitive in terms of a cost standpoint. So that's why the whole point of REV is to try to create a platform so that we can reduce the capital intensity of the whole sector, so that we can use storage. But there are ample renewable power resources which are available to be delivered into the state. I think on Indian Point, I was involved in that. We got to, again, put all this in context, that Indian Point, because you cannot evacuate the area around the plant. And so it was a safety issue, also built on a fault. And so I'm not going to debate, this issue with you. Now, with respect to the resources that are going to replace it, one of the reasons why the deal was negotiated is to allow market participants to figure out the resources. And there are lots of renewable resources that, in fact, are being used to replace that plant. And we've been planning for years for the closure of that plant. And we've been planning for years for the closure of that plant. So so that's, and the governor has always been, I think, consistent about the answer to that question. So thank you very much.
Richard, thank you so much. We try at our organization to be religious about two things. One is our nonpartisan nature, open to all perspectives, and the other, trying to be respectful of people's times and schedules. We could obviously go on for quite a long time with questions and discussion here. I definitely want to keep our commitment to all of you. There are little cards at your place along with information about our organization. If you have a second to fill out the card, that would be very helpful to us. I also want to thank our great DC staff, Kevin and Helen, who you met at the front, our development person who's worked with us today. But most importantly, I just want to thank all of you for being here. Please do what you can to help us generate greater awareness and participation in what we're doing, because it definitely is beginning to make an impact with people we're working with in Washington and around. The things we did leave for you is a little pristine screen takeaway, which I personally love. I love these little knickknacks, and what they do is they go on the back of your phone. They remind you about us all the time, and they let you wipe and clean your screen whenever you need to. So it's a fantastic takeaway. It's the best swag. To take it, put it on the back of your phone, and think of us every time you make a call, do a text, or do your email. Thanks again for coming, and we hope to see you soon. If I can get everybody's attention, as everybody finishes kind of getting their food and getting seated, we're going to get started because we want to be sure to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion following our presentation, which will start in just a minute. Welcome to all of you. I'm Bill Squadron. I'm president of OurEnergyPolicy.org and the Our Energy Policy Foundation. And a special welcome to everyone here today, and for those of you who have been with us before, I'm sure you noted that we are growing, changing. This is a larger venue, mostly, of course, due to our extremely distinguished guest, Richard Kauffman, but also a reflection of the fact that we as an organization are really taking things to another level. And I'll talk for just a minute about that, but we're finding that the mission of the organization, which is to bring diverse perspectives together online, at live events, in states, in Washington,